The story we tell today involves one of the most remarkable naval engagements of the Second World War. In the dark waters off Guadalcanal, a single American battleship faced overwhelming odds against one of Japan's most formidable warships. The USS Washington, a North Carolina-class battleship of tremendous firepower and modern equipment, stood ready to defend American interests in the Pacific theater. This was November of 1942, a time when naval warfare was being transformed by new technology and tactics. The Japanese had proven themselves to be skilled night fighters in previous engagements around Guadalcanal. American naval forces had suffered defeats in previous night battles in this region. However, the USS Washington possessed something that would prove decisive in the coming engagement. Her advanced radar system would allow her crew to see in the darkness where their Japanese opponents could not. The night of November 14th and 15th would see one of the most one-sided naval battles in history. This engagement would demonstrate the critical importance of technological superiority in modern naval warfare. The radar equipment aboard the USS Washington represented the cutting edge of military technology. American engineers had developed systems that could detect enemy ships at great distances through darkness and fog. The Japanese Navy, despite their excellence in traditional gunnery methods, had not developed comparable radar systems. This technological gap would create an unprecedented advantage for the American battleship. The coming battle would last only minutes, but would have tremendous strategic significance. The USS Washington would prove that American naval power, when combined with technological advancement, could overcome any opponent. This night battle off Guadalcanal would become a turning point in the Pacific War. The evening of November 14th began with both fleets maneuvering in the waters around Guadalcanal. American commanders had received intelligence about Japanese naval movements in the region. The Japanese were attempting to reinforce their garrison on Guadalcanal with additional troops and supplies. To accomplish this task, they had assembled a formidable naval task force that included battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Japanese battleship Kirishima led this task force with the intention of bombarding Henderson Field. American naval forces had been deployed to intercept and prevent this bombardment mission. The USS Washington took up position alongside other American warships in the battle line. The American task force commander positioned his ships to defend Guadalcanal against the approaching Japanese force. As darkness fell over the Solomon Islands, visibility became extremely limited for all ships involved. The night promised to be one of great confusion and danger for both combatants. Japanese commanders relied on their crews' training in night combat tactics and their considerable experience. The USS Washington relied instead on her radar system and the training of her gunnery crews. The battle would test whether technology could overcome experience in naval warfare. Both sides moved toward their moment of destiny in the darkness. The radar operators aboard the USS Washington began detecting the approaching Japanese fleet at considerable distance. These skilled technicians could read the radar signals and translate them into accurate targeting information. American gunnery officers prepared their guns and crews for action. The battleship Kirishima was unaware that she was being tracked by an invisible electronic beam. Japanese lookouts searched the darkness with their eyes and binoculars, unable to detect their American opponent. The stage was now set for one of history's most decisive moments in naval combat. As the range between the two battleships decreased, the tension aboard the USS Washington intensified. Gun crews stood ready at their stations below decks, waiting for the order to open fire. The radar operators continued to track the Kirishima and relay her position to the fire control officers. American fire control computers received information from the radar and began calculating firing solutions. These mechanical and electrical devices represented some of the most advanced technology of the era. The calculations included distance, ship movements, wind effects, and shell trajectories. Everything had to be coordinated perfectly for the first salvo to be effective. Aboard the Kirishima, the Japanese crew remained unaware of the deadly threat approaching in the darkness. Japanese commanders were still attempting to locate their American opponents using traditional methods. The Kirishima's searchlights suddenly cut through the darkness, catching another American ship in their beam. However, this action inadvertently revealed the Kirishima's position to American observers as well. The USS Washington's radar had already detected the Japanese battleship, but now visual confirmation became possible. The American gunnery officer made his decision and gave the order to commence firing. The 16-inch guns of the USS Washington roared to life in the night. The massive naval cannon fired projectiles weighing nearly a ton each at tremendous velocities. These shells began their journey toward the Kirishima through the darkness. The flash of the American guns illuminated the night sky with an intense orange glow. The shells reached out across the water toward their target with incredible speed. Aboard the Kirishima, Japanese sailors suddenly realized they were under attack from an unseen enemy. The shock of this revelation was compounded by the accuracy of the American fire. The battle that followed would last only minutes, yet it seemed an eternity to the men fighting aboard both ships. The USS Washington's radar system enabled her fire control officers to make rapid adjustments to their aim. After each salvo, the radar operators reported the fall of shot and directed corrections to the guns. This rapid fire cycle gave the American battleship an enormous advantage in combat. The Kirishima attempted to fight back, firing her own formidable armament at the American battleship. However, without accurate targeting information, the Japanese shells frequently missed their intended target. The USS Washington's superior fire control system allowed her to maintain accuracy despite the darkness and the movement of both ships. Shell after shell from the American battleship found their mark on the Japanese vessel. The Kirishima's hull was pierced repeatedly by the massive American projectiles. Fires broke out aboard the Japanese battleship as the devastating American barrage continued. The power systems and fire control systems of the Kirishima began to fail under the American bombardment. Japanese sailors fought desperately to contain the damage and maintain their ship's fighting capability. The Kirishima's ability to return accurate fire decreased with each passing moment. The American gunnery crews worked with mechanical precision, loading shells and firing them in rapid succession. The radar system continued to guide the American guns with uncanny accuracy. The battle demonstrated the superiority of mechanical calculation over human observation in naval warfare. After only 7 minutes of intense combat, the outcome had been decided. The Kirishima had been struck by approximately 9 major hits from the USS Washington's guns. These massive hits had inflicted catastrophic damage to the Japanese battleship. The devastating barrage from the USS Washington had effectively disabled the Kirishima as a fighting vessel. The Japanese battleship's ability to maintain her course became increasingly difficult as damage accumulated. Multiple hits in the hull had caused severe flooding in several compartments. The Japanese crew worked frantically to make emergency repairs and keep their ship afloat. However, the extent of the damage was simply too great to overcome in the short term. The Kirishima's superstructure had been heavily damaged by American shell fire. The Japanese fire control systems had been destroyed or rendered inoperative by the American bombardment. The radar operators aboard the USS Washington continued to track the wounded Japanese battleship. American gunnery officers stood ready to resume fire if the Kirishima attempted to launch another attack. However, the Japanese battleship had been reduced to a state where offensive action was no longer possible. The crew of the Kirishima made the difficult decision to abandon efforts to save their ship. Orders were given to prepare for possible abandonment of the vessel. Japanese sailors worked to save their shipmates and prepare lifeboats for use. The Kirishima began to lose her battle against the incoming water. The great Japanese battleship, which had once seemed invincible, was sinking into the waters of the Solomon Islands. The crew of the USS Washington had achieved a remarkable victory in just 7 minutes of combat. The American sailors, understood that they had been part of a historic moment in naval warfare. Word spread throughout the ship about the successful engagement and the damage inflicted on the Kirishima. The men aboard the USS Washington had proven the value of their training and their equipment. The night battle off Guadalcanal would be remembered as a turning point in the Pacific War. The sinking of the Kirishima represented a significant strategic and symbolic victory for American naval forces. The Japanese Navy had suffered a serious blow to its remaining battleship strength. The Kirishima had been one of Japan's most important remaining capital ships, and her loss weakened Japanese naval power considerably. Japanese commanders had to reassess their strategy in the Solomon Islands after this devastating defeat. The raid that the Kirishima had been sent to execute never took place as planned. Henderson Field remained undamaged and continued to serve American air operations. American aircraft could continue to strike at Japanese positions and shipping in the region. The failure of this Japanese reinforcement effort was a major strategic setback for Japanese operations in the Solomons. The naval superiority demonstrated by the USS Washington had a profound effect on subsequent naval operations. Japanese commanders became more cautious about committing their remaining capital ships to battle. The fear of encountering American battleships equipped with radar became a significant factor in Japanese tactical planning. The psychological impact of this defeat resonated throughout the Japanese Navy. Officers and sailors alike recognized that the Americans had developed a technological advantage that could not be easily overcome. The traditional Japanese methods of night warfare had proven ineffective against radar-guided American gunnery. This realization led to serious discussions within the Japanese Navy about their future strategy. The need for technological development became apparent to Japanese military planners. However, by this time in the war, Japan's industrial capacity was strained to its limits. The manufacturing facilities required to produce advanced radar systems were not readily available to the Japanese Navy. The USS Washington had demonstrated capabilities that would reshape naval warfare for decades to come. Her successful engagement with the Kirishima proved that radar-guided fire control was vastly superior to traditional methods. American naval officers studied the battle intensively to extract lessons that could be applied to future operations. The battle became a textbook example of the importance of technological superiority in military conflict. American naval academies would study this engagement for generations of officers to come. The principles demonstrated in this night battle would influence naval warfare for the remainder of the Second World War. American battleships would become increasingly confident in their ability to engage Japanese vessels. The presence of the USS Washington and her sister ships became a powerful deterrent to Japanese naval operations. Japanese commanders had to carefully consider whether engaging American capital ships was worth the risk. The loss of the Kirishima meant that Japan had lost one of her last effective battleships. Japanese shipbuilding facilities were unable to replace such a loss due to American naval and air operations. The damage inflicted on Japanese shipyard capacity made it impossible to quickly construct replacement vessels. Japan's naval power would continue to decline as the war progressed. The USS Washington would continue to serve the American Navy for the remainder of the war and beyond. The reputation established by this single night's combat would follow the USS Washington throughout her career. American sailors who had served aboard the battleship became proud custodians of her historic legacy. The battleship became a symbol of American naval power and technological superiority. The crew of the USS Washington consisted of hundreds of dedicated sailors who had trained extensively for combat. These men came from various parts of the United States and represented different backgrounds and experiences. They were united in their commitment to their ship and to the defense of their nation. The radar operators aboard the USS Washington were particularly essential to the victory. These highly trained technical specialists understood their equipment and could interpret the radar signals with great skill. They maintained constant vigilance throughout the battle, providing crucial targeting information to the gunnery officers. The fire control officers who coordinated the weapon systems were similarly skilled and dedicated. These officers had to make split-second decisions about when to open fire and when to adjust the aim of the guns. Their judgments were vindicated by the accuracy and effectiveness of the American fire. The gun crews who loaded and fired the massive 16-inch guns performed their duties with remarkable precision. Working in the confines of the turrets and gun houses, these men functioned as a coordinated team. Each member of the gun crew understood his role and performed it without hesitation. The officer corps aboard the USS Washington provided leadership that coordinated all these different functions into a unified combat force. The commanding officer of the USS Washington made the decisions that led to this successful engagement. His leadership during the battle and in the preceding hours of preparation demonstrated exceptional naval command ability. The executive officer and other senior officers supported the commanding officer in executing the battle plan. Lower-ranking officers throughout the ship conveyed orders and coordinated their respective departments. The success of the battle was ultimately a product of the collective efforts of the entire crew working in harmony. The tactical situation during the battle reflected years of thought about naval warfare among American officers. American naval doctrine had emphasized the importance of gunnery accuracy and fire control as crucial elements of naval combat. American naval academies had trained officers in the principles of naval tactics and strategy. American sailors had been drilled repeatedly in their combat duties to ensure they could perform under pressure. The crew of the USS Washington had been drilled in battle stations procedures until these routines became almost automatic. Every sailor knew where to go and what to do when the ship went to general quarters. The chain of command functioned smoothly during the engagement, allowing information and orders to flow efficiently throughout the ship. Communications between different departments were maintained, even as the ship shook from the recoil of her own guns. The damaged control parties stood ready to respond to any damage that might be inflicted on the USS Washington. These brave sailors understood that their quick response to damage could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The ship's medical personnel prepared treatment areas for any wounded sailors who might need their services. The engineering spaces of the USS Washington functioned smoothly, providing power to the guns and propulsion systems. The engine room personnel ensured that steam pressure remained constant and that the ship could maintain her desired speed and course. Below decks, sailors worked in dangerous conditions to support the combat operations occurring above them. These men could not see the battle that raged above them, but understood their crucial role in the victory. The technological advantages possessed by the USS Washington extended beyond her radar system. The battleship's fire control computer was a mechanical device of remarkable sophistication for its time. This computer received inputs from the radar and from other fire control instruments aboard the ship. The device calculated firing solutions almost instantaneously, allowing the guns to track their target continuously. American engineers had developed this system through years of research and testing. The industrial capacity of the United States had allowed the production of these advanced systems for many American warships. The 16-inch guns of the USS Washington represented the pinnacle of American gun design. These weapons were capable of firing at much greater distances than previous battleship guns. The projectiles fired by these guns retained their accuracy even at extreme ranges. The ammunition supply for these guns was stored in magazines deep within the ship's hull. Ammunition handlers worked to supply the guns with a continuous stream of shells during the battle. The logistics of supplying ammunition to modern battleship guns required complex planning and organization. The gun turrets themselves were heavily armored to protect the gun crews from enemy fire. The armor protection of the USS Washington was designed to withstand enemy battleship shells. American naval architects had studied previous battles to understand where protection was most needed. The design of the USS Washington reflected decades of accumulated knowledge about battleship design and construction. Every feature of the ship had been carefully considered to maximize her combat effectiveness. The Japanese battleship Kirishima represented an earlier generation of battleship design. The Kirishima had been commissioned into service several years before the USS Washington. Japanese naval architects had designed the Kirishima to be a powerful and effective warship. However, the Japanese had not incorporated radar systems into their battleships until relatively late in the war. The Kirishima relied primarily on traditional methods of fire control based on visual observation. Japanese naval gunnery had been highly developed through years of training and practice. Japanese sailors had demonstrated remarkable gunnery accuracy in previous naval engagements. However, accurate gunnery was greatly hampered by the darkness that had fallen over the Solomon Islands. The Kirishima's crew had attempted to use searchlights to illuminate their targets, but this had actually revealed their own position to the Americans. The decision to use searchlights had been a tactical error that had cost the Japanese dearly. Once the Kirishima's position had been revealed by her own searchlights, the American radar system was able to direct accurate fire at her. The Kirishima's armor protection, while substantial, had not been sufficient to withstand the weight of fire directed at her. The Japanese battleship had been designed before the existence of advanced radar fire control systems. Japanese naval architects had not anticipated that their ships would someday face enemies armed with such technology. The strategic implications of this naval engagement extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The defeat of the Kirishima demonstrated to American commanders that their warships possessed a decisive technological advantage. This realization emboldened American naval planners to pursue aggressive operations in the Pacific. American naval commanders became increasingly confident that they could engage Japanese capital ships with reasonable assurance of success. This confidence influenced American strategic planning for the remainder of the war. The defeat was a severe blow to Japanese morale throughout their military services. The belief in Japanese naval superiority, which had been maintained through the early years of the war, began to erode. Young officers and sailors in the Japanese Navy began to understand that the Americans possessed capabilities that the Japanese could not match. The technological gap between the American and Japanese navies was becoming increasingly apparent to military observers. American factories continued to produce radar systems and other advanced weapons at an accelerating rate. Japanese industrial capacity was unable to produce these items in comparable quantities. The disparity in production capacity between the two nations continued to widen as the war progressed. American commanders recognized this disparity and planned their future operations accordingly. The destruction of the Kirishima was not simply a naval victory, but represented the emergence of American technological and industrial superiority over Japan. The USS Washington's engagement with the Kirishima represented a watershed moment in the history of naval warfare. Prior to this engagement, naval battles had been conducted through a combination of visual observation and traditional gunnery methods. The battle demonstrated that electronic systems could revolutionize the conduct of naval combat. American naval officers recognized that radar would transform all future naval warfare. The principles demonstrated at Guadalcanal would influence battleship design for decades to come. American battleships built after this engagement incorporated lessons learned from this and other battles. The defense against radar-guided attacks became a crucial concern for naval architects. Electronic warfare and countermeasures would become increasingly important aspects of naval combat. The dominance of battleships as the capital ships of naval fleets would eventually end as naval aviation and guided missiles developed. However, in 1942, the successful use of radar-guided battleship gunnery represented the apex of battleship combat. The USS Washington had participated in a moment of supreme naval warfare achievement. The night engagement off Guadalcanal represented one of the last decisive moments of battleship warfare. Within a few years, naval aviation would become the dominant weapon in naval warfare. Aircraft would replace battleships as the primary weapon systems of naval forces. However, the USS Washington's victory demonstrated the potential of battleship combat when modern technology was properly employed. The legacy of the USS Washington extended well beyond her naval service during the Second World War. The battleship became an American icon of naval power and technological achievement. Veterans of the USS Washington carried their experiences with pride throughout their lives. The USS Washington participated in numerous other naval operations during the Pacific War. The battleship continued to provide gunfire support for American amphibious operations throughout the Pacific. The USS Washington remained in service with the United States Navy long after the war had ended. The battleship was modernized multiple times to keep her combat effectiveness current with changing naval requirements. The USS Washington participated in Korean War operations as a gunfire support vessel. The battleship continued to represent American military power during the early Cold War years. Eventually, advancing naval technology made battleships obsolete for the primary role of naval warfare. The USS Washington was placed in reserve and eventually scrapped, but her memory lived on in naval history. American naval museums and historical societies maintained records and artifacts related to the USS Washington. The battleship's achievement during a night engagement off Guadalcanal continued to be studied by military historians and scholars. The USS Washington became a symbol of American naval prowess and technological advancement. Future generations of American naval officers studied the battle to extract lessons relevant to modern naval warfare. The USS Washington's victory demonstrated principles that remain relevant to modern military operations. The night battle off Guadalcanal remains one of the most remarkable naval engagements in all of human history. The engagement demonstrated the decisive importance of technological superiority in military conflict. The crew of the USS Washington had proven that American sailors could outfight and outthink their Japanese opponents. The victory had occurred not through numerical superiority, but through technological advantage and superior training. 7 minutes of intense combat had reversed the course of naval warfare in the Solomon Islands. Japanese naval commanders had to accept that they no longer possessed the ability to maintain surface superiority over American naval forces. The psychological and strategic impact of this single night's combat resonated through the remainder of the Pacific War. American commanders gained confidence that their navy could defeat any Japanese naval force they would encounter. The destruction of the Kirishima meant that Japan could not replace her capital ship losses as quickly as American yards were producing new warships. The balance of naval power shifted decisively in favor of the United States following this engagement. Japanese strategy in the Pacific had to be reformulated to account for this new reality. The earlier Japanese victories that had seemed so impressive were now placed in a new light by this American victory. The technological advances that American scientists and engineers had developed were now proving decisive in actual combat. The USS Washington's engagement with the Kirishima represents a pivotal moment in the history of warfare and technology. This remarkable night engagement represents far more than just a battle between two warships. It represents the triumph of American technological innovation over traditional military methods. It demonstrates the importance of continuous training and professional excellence among naval personnel. It shows the value of investing in research and development for advanced weapon systems. It proves that courage and dedication of military personnel remain essential even in an age of advanced technology. The men who served aboard the USS Washington displayed all of these qualities in abundance. Their actions on that night in November 1942 changed the course of the Pacific War. The naval power that the USS Washington represented would be instrumental in achieving American victory in the Pacific. The fleet of which the USS Washington was a part would eventually eclipse all Japanese naval forces in the Pacific Ocean. American naval superiority would be complete by the end of the war. The USS Washington had contributed significantly to this achievement through her combat capabilities and the professional excellence of her crew. The battleship had demonstrated that American military forces possessed the capability to defeat any opponent in any theater of operations. The engagement with the Kirishima became a defining moment in American naval history. The USS Washington would be remembered as one of the great warships of the Second World War. Her name would be honored and celebrated in American naval circles and among the general public for generations to come.